Hello, my name is Erica, and I am a hobby macaron baker. And by day, I am a marketing and communications professional, and I have a background in design, graphic design, web design, and development. So I've seen a lot of folks in this macaron group asking questions about logos and graphic design in the past. And I thought I'd throw together a really quick webinar. I'll try to keep it short and sweet. And I will provide some slides, these slides as a PDF that you can print and reference at home as well. So you don't have to watch the whole video again if you don't want to. So this is really going to be about the top 5 things I think most home businesses and home bakers should know before they approach a graphic designer to design logos and other business collateral. So I will touch on some brand basics that kind of include how logo is wrapped into that. And then I want to teach you just a little bit about design elements and how to read a design, how to decode a design into its separate pieces and understand how it can work for you or work against you. And then I'll touch on some more technical aspects of the different file types you should request and the printing basics if you're working with a local printer. You know, what you need to send them, how to understand how to talk to your printer and get the goods that you need to really make your business shine. And I'm going to wrap up with 10 questions that you should ask before you commit to a business brand or a logo design. Now, companies can spend millions of dollars and years developing their brand voice and how they want to be perceived by the public. And this is kind of a very simple version of the difference between your logo and your brand. And while you don't have to flesh out a brand in the same way that an enterprise company might, like you don't have to develop customer personas and conduct focus groups and lay out all the ways you can distinguish yourself from your competitors, right? Especially if you're doing an at-home, a cottage business, farmers markets, even opening a storefront bakery in your town, you're probably not going to need to do some of the crazy legwork that can go into a full brand representation. But it is worth considering customer service, how people perceive you, what attitude you put out, and how your colors and packaging and all of those things create a visual shortcut to your business, right? So we're going to not focus so much on being super well-rounded and highly competitive, but you should still give some thought to what your company is and how you want to be perceived before you plunk down some money on a designer. Now, with the business that I had started, I asked my clients a minimum of 25 questions when I started working with a company, but these are really the top 5 I would recommend for home bakers and macro makers to help you figure out what you want your business to be and give yourself some tools that your designer can work with visually. So first off, what's your story? Now, a story isn't just beginning, middle, end. It can be normal, explosion, new normal. For example, let's say your story is, I was in college and I was all set to be an economics major and I just hated everything about it. And then my funding ran out and my house flooded and I had to figure out a new thing, and I moved into a new space that had a great kitchen, and I discovered a love of baking, and therefore I quit school, and my new normal is that I bring joy to the people around me with tasty delicacies, right? So normal, I am in school for economics, and explosion, my funding ran out and my life was chaos and everything was crazy. And then new normal is, but I discovered a passion for baking in that, and now I bring tasty treats to everybody around me, right? So another question to answer for yourself is, what kind of personality does your business have? Is it quirky and fun and, childlike, or is it really sophisticated and elegant and timeless? Macarons are amazing little confections that really could go either way. What 5 words describe your business? So for you, I want you to think about the 5 words that you can narrow down to describe your business. For me at Griffin Street, that came down to quirky, colorful, deliberate, curious, versatile. For a baking business, those might be tasty, reliable, trustworthy, right? What 5 words do you want your customers to use to describe you? And they may align with the 5 words that you personally would use, but you can also go out and ask customers if you have them already. And if you don't, ask some friends, ask some folks that you've baked for how they would describe your business and see how well it aligns. See how well the perception matches up with what you would like them to perceive. And then finally, who is your ideal customer? So this doesn't have to be super complicated. This is really more about thinking, do you want your macarons, in the local coffee shop? Is this a business to business proposition? Or are you wanting passersby at a storefront or at a farmer's market? Or are you wanting private clients and that kind of thing? So start with your brand. Start with these 5 questions and get really clear on what you want your business to be and how you want it described, and then design your logo. So start with who you are and what you want to communicate, and then you can figure out your logo with your designer. And bring these answers to your designer, of course. So now I want to move on to actual design principles and design elements. And it's really important to understand that every design communicates something, whether it's intentional or not. We are meaning-making creatures by nature, and the science of art and design is not necessarily about how pretty or aesthetic something is, as much as it is about what your design communicates, how our human psychology and cultural and geographic ties influence what we see, and how neurotypical brains are wired to experience and decode the world. So, to that end, there are several replicable design principles and design elements that we can rely on to produce predictable results in our audience. So I'm not going to bore you going through all the 12 principles and elements, but I do want you to think especially about contrast and movement and hierarchy as the top 3 ways you can highlight the main point of communication you're trying to make. For example, if you are selling macarons and there is another macaron seller in the farmer's market, which would you expect to be more important for someone to view from far away? Your business name or your wares? If you have an easily recognizable business name that you've built up in the community for 20 years, your reputation might be tied to that name, and in which case, that may be the thing to highlight. Generally, unless you're a global entity, your business name is probably secondary to your wares and doesn't really add to the cause, right? So from 15 feet away, presuming somebody knows what macarons are, would they be more likely to visit your booth if they can see Happy Days, which in and of itself is kind of meaningless and does not give an expectation or an indication of what they can expect from you? Or would it be more important to highlight macarons, which is then abundantly clear what you have to offer? Your 3 biggest tools to think about here are going to be contrast, movement, how your design leads the eye to what you want them to read, and hierarchy, which is what they're going to read and understand first. Now I want to touch on design elements themselves, and these are the actual shapes and lines and such that we can use to execute the principles on the previous slide. So while the principles are more important in many ways, you can leave a lot of that to your designer. That's why you're hiring them. The most important thing I want you to think about is how to learn to identify the elements in a design and then think about how they support those 3 key principles that I introduced: contrast, hierarchy, and movement, to make sure that your audience understands what you want them to understand. So identify what parts are shapes. And my hint for you is that letters can also be shapes. What part of the design is a line? Lines lead the eye and they create movement and they help focus your eyes in on things that you want people to see. What part of it relies on size? What part color? How does texture enhance what we see? So when I'm looking at this Happy Days macaron, you can see there's contrast of color. There's white space. I've got a stack of macarons on the left-hand side, which you'll see probably before you see letters. And it's likely that if you glanced at this from far away, you'd see a green macaron and the word macaron. And then secondarily, you'd read the business name, Happy Days, and you'd start to register what this business is about. So think about size, line, shape, color, texture, and space, and see if you can identify what each of those elements are, because that's also a way to make your logo adaptable. Once you can positively identify the elements in your logo or your design and how they support those principles of contrast and hierarchy and movement, that in turn support your communication goals. Now you can tease them apart and you can create a family of logos that can translate or morph for a variety of sizes and shapes and mediums. This is especially key for small home bakers or just small businesses in general. How do you rearrange the elements of that logo to suit a variety of business needs and still have them look related? So you can see on here, none of these designs are actually the original design that I showed you on the previous slide. And yet, when you see them all together, it's very apparent that they belong together. They have harmony in color, they have harmony in shape, they all rely on the same typefaces. And this is really key because it means you don't have to be married to one size or shape that may not be good for all applications. So when you are talking to a designer, be sure that you can also identify those elements that the designer puts in your logo and ask them if they can rearrange them. And ask yourself, how are these going to apply on a round sticker? How is this going to look embroidered, right? How is this going to look for a menu versus a 6-foot farmer's market banner? Ask yourself these questions when you're looking at a logo. At the end of the day, the best rule that I can give you really is keep it simple. So consider that every element that you add to a logo design communicates something. And every element you add is in competition for that communication. With colors, there's a ton to know about color and color theory, but many people understand this intuitively, so I won't get too pedantic here. But again, keep it simple and keep your contrast high. And if you have the money, ask your designer for a primary color palette and a secondary accent palette that you may want in the future if you're doing web design or recipe books and things like that. In terms of fonts, also don't go overboard. Even really good designers have difficulty blending more than 2 fonts. So if you have 3 fonts in there, think again and take one out, okay? Especially if you're going to try to DIY it. Now, something that a lot of people may not know, and my background for many years was in herbal supplements and designing labels for herbal supplements, is that the FDA does not allow text smaller than 6 points. So if you have small packaging and you're trying to fulfill FDA guidelines, you'll have to make sure that all of your ingredients and all of the information on your label fit at a size larger than 6 points. And once you feel confident keeping things simple and reducing your design to the essence of your business, once you are absolutely clear on what you're trying to communicate to your customers, then you may want to know a few additional very fine details. These are things that your designer should know, but sometimes if you're hiring a new designer or if you're trying to do it yourself, these things may be helpful things to keep in mind. First, elements with a lot of gradients or color and detail are going to be hard to silkscreen or embroider. Now, printing has come a long way in the last 20 years, but you can only do so much with paint and thread, so keep that in mind. Keep the design simple, keep it uncomplicated, especially if you think you're going to add, embroidered aprons or you're going to get some silkscreen shirts and things like that. in terms of color, again, printing has come a really long way, and digital printing supports an incredible array of colors. But do keep in mind that if you are trying to attract attention in a busy marketplace, you'll want high contrast. Now, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, recommends at least 70% contrast for folks who have contrast or vision issues, to see things clearly. And that is frankly a great rule for any banners and any distance viewing. Similarly, aging eyes have difficulties with reds and oranges. Our red cones in our eyes tend to falter first as we age, which is why a lot of resident homes go with pastel palettes and things like that. It doesn't mean you can't use it, but you may want to think about if part of your audience or your location, your geographic location, is catering to an aging audience. Maybe go with blues and blacks, right? Instead of a highly red or orange logo. Another thing about that is that about 10% of the population is red-green colorblind. If you are fully abled in your color vision and you want to experience what this is like, you can install a colorblind web extension in your web browser like Chrome and take a look at your favorite website with one of these filters. You might be surprised to see what they look like when they're not in full color. And another reason to avoid, especially red and green together in overlap, is that they cause what's called jitter. That optical illusion where it makes it look like the two colors are moving against each other, even though they're not. And so even for fully visioned folks, red and green can be very difficult to read when they're overlapped. Finally, there's a couple of notes here about fonts or typefaces. And my recommendation is that if your font size has to be smaller than 10 points to fit on your label, adjust your design or your packaging. Now, the FDA recommends a minimum of 6 points, but that is awfully small, think chapstick, to read. So I say if it can be 10 points or larger, if it can't, think about adjusting your packaging. And if you're going to branch out into long form, making a cookbook or doing web stuff, paragraph text in print is easiest to read in a serif font, which is this type of Times New Roman kind of typeface I have up here. Whereas on the web, it's the opposite. It's sans serif, which is exactly what this sentence is written in. So just something to think about if you have a variety of designs and applications. And again, most of these things should really be in the domain of your designer, but I'm addressing them so that you are armed with that knowledge as well. And if you have more questions about elements, colors, fonts, let me know and I can try to answer them in the comments. And then I want to move on to some of the more technical aspects of file types. The most important file types that you want to make sure you get from your designer are your native design file. So this is whatever program they use to actually design it in. In this case, the industry standard is Illustrator, but sometimes you may get a Photoshop version, some in InDesign. Generally, they're Adobe, but some folks are still using CorelDRAW and a variety of other design softwares. You'll also want an EPS file. This is an encapsulated PostScript, as well as some kind of PNG or JPEG, which is just a standard image file. And you'll want it with a similar file name so that you know what your logo files are in case you don't have the specialty software to open them. So what I mean is, if your designer gives you a .ai file and you don't have Illustrator, you won't be able to open it or see what it looks like unless there's also a PNG or JPEG image file with a similar name that will give you that reference. I'm including several file types on here so that you know the key points for each, but at the end of the day, make sure you're getting the EPS file, the prepared design file, and some version that an average software viewer can read or view, right? And this may be a good one to print out if you need a handy reference for sending to your printer or for working with your designer. Now, with those file types, the most common type that you'll send to your printer is your EPS, or if it's a fully prepped flyer file or something like that, a PDF. Now, what you need to know before sending files to a printer is that all your fonts are outlined so that the printer doesn't have to have that same font installed on their computer. And that just means that your letters become shapes instead of editable text. And that's really important because especially if you have a really quirky font that you're using, unless you also send the font file to your printer, if they don't have it on their computer, you don't know what you're going to get, unless it's outlined into shapes. Another thing is that your file is in CYMK color, which is cyan, yellow, magenta, and key, which is black. That is a 4-color standard process. And that it's at least 300 dots per inch or pixels per inch for standard stuff. And if necessary, that there is a 1/8 inch bleed around the whole design. So if you want that edge-to-edge print, you actually have to make it bigger than your final product and cut it to fit so that you can print edge-to-edge. Now, if you're using the same images for a web designer to make you a web page, then the file should be a different color space. This is red, green, and blue because light mixes differently than ink, right? So then you would want an RGB or hex code image, and you don't need as much density. So your pixels per inch or your dots per inch can be 72 or more, and that your design can scale up or scale down for any browser or device. However, at the end of the day, the best thing you can do for yourself is develop a relationship with one of your local printers. Then you don't have to remember all of these technical specifications. They can help guide you through it. And frankly, the cost of digital printing has reduced so much in recent years that a lot of local printers can accommodate the same work that you do online at sites like Vistaprint or Moo or Overnight Prints, and at the same cost to you by the time you pay shipping. Plus, they tend to excel in a few areas. For example, the local printer I work with where I live will call me if they find a typo. Like, Overnight Prints is not going to do that. They're just human beings, and I have a relationship with them. And if I miss something up, they're more than likely to call me and say, hey, are you sure you want us to print 500 copies of this? My local printer also helps me find papers like paper stock, mailing list, custom cuts, and things like that I require from job to job that may not be available online. My local city benefits because the sales tax I pay my local printer comes right back into my local economy. Plus, they can often turn around projects in much less time than the online companies. And they often have die cut or imprint vendors that they can work with to make sure that I always get what I expect. Another thing that happens is that when they do mess up, which frankly is very rare, I know exactly who to call and I can talk to a human. So this doesn't necessarily mean Kinko's, which is a franchise or a corporate chain, but it might be if that's what you have and you can develop a relationship with some of the folks who work there. And if that's what you have locally, by all means, go for it. And that's also not to say that Overnight Prints, Next Day Flyers, Vistaprint, Moo, or any of the other printers are bad. I have used them all and I have had success with them all. But if you can find and build a relationship, you're more likely to save money and get a better result over time. Finally, let's talk about what you need to know from your designer before you get a contract. Aside from timeline and cost, these are the details you should know the answers to, and you should get it in writing. This protects both of you, both parties. You get the logo you pay for, and they will not spend countless hours in revisions for no additional money. So let's talk about these. Do you have a portfolio or testimonials that I can reference? If it's just a new designer starting out, they may not have a lot of testimonials, but they're likely to still have a college portfolio that they can show you. And if the price point is right, it may be worth working with them and becoming one of their first testimonials. There's nothing wrong with that, but certainly ask and see what other work they've produced. Will my design be fully custom? Now, you may be lucky enough to afford and get somebody who draws out hundreds of logos and works with you to digitize it, etc. But a lot of folks, myself included, will scour vector graphic websites and download free or paid for logos and adjust them. And there's nothing wrong with that, but just know up front whether or not they're going to go to Adobe Stock, pull somebody's standard Macaron logo, slap a name on it and call it good, or whether they're willing and able to create something custom from that original template. There's nothing inherently bad about using a template, and there's so many out there and they save so much time design-wise. However, is it something that another business is also going to have because it's not customized in any way? Will I have ownership rights to the final design? There are some designers who retain ownership rights, which means that you may have to license the usage of your own logo from them, or you may have to always return to them because they won't turn over the original files or the original rights to the design. And so if you needed something changed or tweaked or whatever, you'd have to go back and pay them more money to get the design. So make sure that you will have the ownership rights of the final design and be able to get the right file types to support it if you ever did have to take it to a different designer, which is the next question. What file types and deliverables can I expect? Are you going to be able to get the original AI file? If you can't and you need changes, how do you go about getting changes done to the logo? Are you going to be able to get the EPS file? Are you going to be able to get JPEGs, PNGs, things that you can send to your web designer and to your printer? Remember, 2 different file types. So make sure that it's written down exactly what those deliverables will be. And then what is included in the price and how many revisions do I get for that price? So be very clear. It's one thing to get 3 designs and then revise it 15 times, right? So make sure. A lot of designers will say, I'll give you a choice of 3 and then you get 3 revisions. That's pretty common. But be very clear about what those revisions are and what the cost is if you require more revisions beyond the 3 or the whatever the number is they supply for you. And then finally, what support will I receive and how do I contact you for support? So if you continue to have questions, if you need printing, if you need a connection to your local printer, if you need support, if a file type doesn't work for some reason, how do you get a hold of them? And do they continue to support you, on retainer or just in general? Find out what kind of support you're going to get for that logo and how to make sure that they're responsive to that need. So now that you have determined what your brand is and who your audience is and what the most important thing you need to communicate will be, and your designer has mocked up some ideas, it is time for you to now take the last 4 questions of this segment and ask your friends or your colleagues what they like. However, remember that every design communicates something, whether or not it's the right something. Therefore, it's not enough to say, which one do you like? Or is this pretty? Those things are far too subjective. And we are talking about the science of design here. So instead, try these questions. What is the first thing you notice on this image? If the first thing everyone notices on an image is the color, then ask, what do they think that color represents? If the first thing you think they should see is the word macarons, but instead the first thing everyone sees is like an elephant that you've put in your logo, then maybe one of the elements needs to be adjusted to give more hierarchy or a higher hierarchy and more contrast and move the eye to the word macaron. So now you have to go back and adjust the elements to fit those design principles in order to communicate effectively what you're trying to communicate. In other words, would a change in size or contrast reduce the importance of the elephant and highlight the word macaron better? Now, another thing to ask is when you see this, what is the first word or phrase that comes to mind? Instead of asking folks how they feel or what they like, ask them what word or phrase it reminds them of. This can expose cultural associations and other associations that might otherwise be lost. So, if you have an elephant in your design, some people may associate that with the circus. Some people may associate that with like the elephant in the room, the thing we're not talking about. Other people may see it as a symbol of good luck, of loyalty, of matriarchy. Elephants can be associated with big, right? Huge, massive, fat, ears they never forget. So there is so much symbolism wrapped up in many icons and logos that it's not enough to say, do you like it? If they don't like elephants, they may not like it. But what word do they associate with it may help you parse whether or not your communication was successful. Similarly, what do you think is the most important word or element? And that's a little bit different because what you first notice and what phrase or word comes to mind are both unconscious associations. But asking what the most important word or element is makes it a conscious association. So now you have to think about what is the most important piece of it. So that way you can identify how they unconsciously see and perceive it. And then, on second thought, how do they consciously see and perceive it? And finally, is there anything vulgar or inadvertently inappropriate or sexual or confusing or plagiaristic about it? Oftentimes, as designers and even as business owners, we tend to see or get stuck in things that other people can very quickly point out are sexual or vulgar or confusing, which aren't to us because we've seen it 100 times and it never struck us in that way. So just make sure there's nothing inadvertently icky about it. And then if you're planning to make a large scale version like a shop sign or a neon sign or a farmer's market banner or a car wrap, anything else like that, have a friend stand 15 feet or 5 meters away and show them the design and ask what they see from a distance. Is it clear? Can they read it? Is there an important element here? Can you pick that out from 15 feet away? Alrighty, so that is all I have for you here for this particular segment. And I could do this for ages and do tutorials in Canva or Publisher or whatever, but I think these key 5 knowledge sets should get you through most of the beginning humps so that you can keep on baking and stress less about the design part of it and be more confident about branding your business in your local area and focus on making awesome macarons. So that's it. I am not selling anything or capturing marketing leads to convert in the future. I have a day job I love, and I have actually closed this Griffin Street studio business a few months back to focus on other things. So please enjoy this knowledge and share it as you feel fit. And I'm happy to critique or help with other designs and design elements unless I get too many inquiries, and then I may have to put some boundaries around it. But I do want to support everyone here, so go forth and be awesome bakers and ask me any questions if you have them. My specialties are really communications and semiotics and web and graphic design, branding, video production, and digital marketing. So if you have questions, hit me up and have a great weekend.